Very much for inviting me. I'm usually standing up in these kinds of rooms talking to you about things like student recruitment and budgets, very stern faces. So I'll try not to kind of revert suddenly back, my mind goes blank, into some kind of faculty presentation. And I'm really pleased to have the chance to come and talk about some work. Angela's just nipped back to my office to produce a little object, which will be interesting research for you to look at. So when she comes back in, I'll introduce her. Angela was the researcher with me on an AHRC project that we completed in the summer called Catalyst, it's actually called Jetty, the project. This is Angela now, enter stage left. And so we finished the project in, I think it was the end of June. It was a collaborative project with a fine artist, a sculptor called Wolfgang Weileder, who works in fine art at the University of Newcastle. And as I'll show in the presentation, Wolfgang have known each other for a few years now, and our relationship's been developing. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that relationship as a way of talking through a little bit about doing collaborative interdisciplinary research and trying to work out what that means and what difference, if any, working collaboratively and interdisciplinary makes. Because that's something I've been doing for a long time in different ways through my career, and I'm still trying to think that through and work out what difference it really makes. So we know it's a good thing to do because you can extract research funding from the research councils if you say you're doing it. But what it really means to do it is still, I think, a very much an open question, and a question we're all engaged with. Obviously, it's good to have John here because the development of the new Institute for Social Futures is precise in a way trying to make sense of what that means. So that's what I'm going to tell you the story, and it's certainly, as you'd expect me to say, not a story with an ending. And in fact, this is a very strange kind of project, really. It's the only project I've ever been involved in that we had in the budget money to do a very impressive, certainly in terms of its looks. I'll leave you to judge whether it's impressive any other way. Book, which was included as a budget in the HLC. This is one advantage, straight away I can tell you, of working with a fine artist. Because to reach that kind of community, this is the kind of way you have to reach them if you want to introduce any kind of words. And Wolfgang, I should say, he managed to persuade the HLC that having a healthy budget to produce a book like this was a meaningful thing to do, and we got the money. So it's the first time I've done a project where you're going to complete the book before the end of the project. So while on the one hand, there's an interesting contradiction running through this. While on the one hand, there's a sense of what does this mean? There are multiple meanings, all the usual thing I'm sure everyone in the room is familiar with. At the same time, I'm actually producing a definitive end of project book. So there's some copies here. There's more copies than there are people in the room. If people are moved and are sufficiently interested, you can take a copy of the book with pleasure. One of the great things of working with this publisher as well, we've actually paid zero for it, but we got given lots of copies of the book to distribute. So the book itself forms part of the catalytical effect, hopefully, of the project by kind of delivering it around. So I can get, if more people want them than's there, I can get some more. So very briefly, I didn't want to spend much time talking about me or my previous work, so I just tried to put up a slide which I've used in a couple of articles that I've written, The Complex History of Sustainability, because it kind of summarises the space that I've been trying to work in over the whole of my career, really, but working in very different kinds of ways. I have always worked in a very interdisciplinary way, but I've worked with engineers, I've worked with economists, I've worked with fine artists and so on. And all through that work I've been trying to kind of interrogate through different ways this kind of complex history and meanings of sustainability, often in a very kind of urban context. So I've been involved, again, as many of you have, in this whole debate about the socio-technical, more recently kind of understanding assemblage thinking and all of this, trying to understand how sustainability is this very contested terrain which differs fundamentally from the kinds of discourses that you get through policy, which is continually trying to compress down the meaning of sustainability, most recently carbon neutrality, but we're moving on, we're seeing a turn away from that again now, in order to make it amenable in one way to kind of policy processes and particular kinds of technical solutions. So that's the space that I've been working in, primarily in recent years, certainly when I came here to Lancaster a year ago from Manchester, where I went to set up originally 10 years ago now, an architecture research centre which explicitly tried to bring architects together with social scientists. So I've been working for a long time on architecture and trying to understand how architects, who are often positioned in sustainability, people like Richard Rogers, Norman Foster, are supposedly embodying the kind of solution. What does a sustainable city really look like? And it's interesting the way that architects have been so successful, they've edged planners out of the way. So there'll be a debate about kind of transport, and there'll be an architect talking about it. More generally about urban design, the architects have colonised this space very, very powerfully. And I think if you look through the works around sustainable design, sustainable architecture, you see expressions of these different materialisations, these different visions of what sustainable cities, sustainable futures is about. And of course, one of our colleagues, Nick Dunn in Leica, has been doing some really interesting work about cities of the future in this kind of space as well. So that's the kind of work that I've been doing, and I've got given lots of other presentations and written quite a bit about that. But I want to actually take the opportunity today to talk about this work with Wolfgang. So Wolfgang is a very interesting character. I don't know, we did a little launch of this book in Leica, beginning of the summer. Wolfgang came along and gave a talk. So he's, on the one hand, a firmly traditional artist in that he sees what he's about is producing artworks. And so he has works which he sells for quite a lot of money. He exhibits in kind of galleries. He's acutely sensitive in any kind of conversation to his value as an artist, and anything that comes out of any joint activity has to make sense within his kind of community. That's how he kind of builds value. But he has this fascinating relationship with the city and developing artistic practice in relation to the city. And this actually is a product of time-lapse photography, and it's actually a piece of kind of classic, the demolition of a modernist piece of architecture. He's done a whole series of these, in the Simile series using time-lapse photography called Atlas, where he's gone around various kind of mostly urban spaces and used this time-lapse, taking every few minutes a kind of image, and then he's got a specialist piece of software which puts all this information together, produces these kinds of images. So you can read these kind of left to right. Some of them you can read more easily than others. But they're all kind of little meditations on urban space, and in a way, I'm making the leap to the theme of this seminar, and to Seymour, mobility and change and time. So our conversation around his work, and let's just tell you a little bit more about it as well before I get into our relationship. So that's the photography, which is classic kind of fine art really, and that's him and a camera. But an interesting set of work he's done has been around architecture. So he's done a piece of work called Transfer, a piece of work called House, and a number of these, and there's some works that he's been doing with me that I'm going to tell you a little bit more around. But in terms of the practice, it's very interesting because he takes actual existing kind of buildings as kind of prototypes and produces kind of scale images of these. But then he reproduces them in kind of real time, working with kind of construction students, and here he is actually rehearsing a piece called House, which then, it's not exactly the same piece, but it's in the same series, gets reproduced in certain kinds of urban locations, in public spaces. So there's a kind of immediately, he's trying to create a relationship, create a conversation between architecture and construction in particular spaces, and invite an audience, in which case here is literally a passing kind of audience, into that kind of conversation. Now these produce, as I said, it's important to keep remembering this in terms of the tensions of Wolfgang's work, with an absolutely, I'm using value judgment, calling it conservative, but a kind of fine art kind of discourse, a fine art practice which produces pieces of work. In this sense, this was a video of this process, so again linked to the time-lapse photography, in real time where you can see this construction going on within the real gallery. And he produces beautiful fine art prints, which you can buy and put on your wall if you can afford them, of this kind of process as well. And obviously produces catalogues, of which this is a kind of catalogue, I think. And let me give you a little taster of this, given that we've got a generous amount of time at this seminar. So this was House Birmingham. So I'll shut up for a moment and you can watch this.
Is there sound?
There is sound, but where can we?
Do you want to?
Can we get it anywhere else? I mean, it's not that significant sound, but just one of those kind of new age landscapes. So, and it goes on like that. So, so this, when we first started chatting, Wolfgang and I, we met at Newcastle University when I again had a similar role. I was a dean of research, and Wolfgang had actually applied for promotion to a readership. And his application, while having lots of merit, wasn't quite in the format or didn't seem to do justice to application. So I was kind of instructed to go off and talk to him and help him prepare his application. So our first encounter was sitting down with his CV and his work in front of us to try and talk about what he did and how it related to kind of promotion criteria. And I could see the problem immediately, because from his own sense of himself and his discourse about what he did, it was very hard to kind of connect it to the kind of things the university were looking for. So I started to read back to him what I found interesting about his work. So on the one hand, his presentation of his outputs was the stuff at the end, the prints, the videos, the stuff that ended, the catalogues that entered in the gallery. So I started talking to him about how he made his work and the kind of relationships with the people who provide the scaffolding, with the construction workers, the students who were involved in actually making these works, of the various kinds of actors that he was pulling together to enable these very complex kind of art pieces to actually be enacted, the kind of planning commissions, the debates with the planning authorities, etc. And the huge complicated process that he was going through in literally assembling and choreographing these kinds of pieces. And you could see the kind of light coming and dropping in front of him here, in the relationship of what his practice was really about, beyond the simple kind of final product, the fine art aesthetic kind of product. So that kind of conversation continued, and invited me to come and chair a panel discussion in one of his exhibitions, and then write a piece in one of his catalogues. So the relationship was then me, in a way, as kind of not kind of formal art traditional critic, but interested social scientist starting to reinterpret work, which he found kind of very interesting in this dialogue. So this is, it's very poor practice to quote yourself, but to express where we were, kind of a good while ago now, and to start to give a sense of what my interests were and how I could start to connect Wolfgang's practice to my interest in terms of opening up architecture, away from this sense of the architect as the kind of auteur, kind of great mind, great person, great man, usually man, almost single-handedly producing these kind of urban visions, to a much more complex set of practices involving all kinds of human, non-human actors in particular kinds of very complex kind of urban spaces. And in terms of his work, it's almost a kind of literally creating this kind of platform, this space for discussions of what architecture was really about, what cities really were for. Little bits of work were done around some of his projects, just inviting kind of comments, and there were possibilities for people to enter kind of online comments, and very revealing in the way that Wolfgang's work really disturbed people, because it really disturbed their sense of what architecture or art was really about, because it just seemed to embody mess and complexity and difficulty and what a waste of money and why are we giving up this kind of space. So again, it invited this kind of real open kind of conversation around what architecture really is and what urbanism is, and obviously connected to a lot of debates that was still going on around science and technology studies around messy complexity. And it seemed to me through this work, in a very powerful way, and probably more powerful than me writing articles about it, here was a kind of material manifestation of that kind of process that was a very interesting thing to engage with. So the next step in our relationship then, when I think I just moved to Manchester, and Wolfgang got in touch and saying, I've been invited to be part of an architecture biennale in Singapore with the theme of kind of, I think it was climate change or environment in some kind of framing anyway. Do you want to be part of the team? And given I'd just been appointed as a professor of architecture, I managed to smuggle myself into that role at Manchester, targeting the centre. I was able to position myself as the architect part of the artist, the architecture, and Olivia Heydrich, who was an engineer at Newcastle. So we put this entry in to be part of this, to be the UK team in this architecture biennale in Singapore. So we put this proposal together, which was to develop something which became, and this was after a significant process of dialogue and changing our minds around things, but in the end we came up with this idea of a stilt house. So the reason we went for the stilt house idea is we wanted to engage with this whole idea again of kind of urban futures, and Singapore, and I'm sure a number of people in the room have probably been to Singapore, is a fascinating laboratory, if it's nothing else, of kind of urbanism. And the way it's gone in a fairly short space of time, from kind of literally living memory, from quite a kind of slum-like kind of city of trade to this shining, kind of postmodern city, North American than the cities in North America, I think, often. And of course, the original architectural typology of that kind of area has almost totally gone now. And if you're lucky, you can find it in a kind of open living museum kind of setting. But again, of course, this was still quite a strong architectural form within living memory. So we decided to use this as a device to try and contrast these different, the urban past, the urban future, and to suggest that this actually wasn't a kind of predetermined trajectory. This was about political choice. Now, the other element of this story, which is what Angela ran back for, was this. And I'll pass this around. This is called Aquadyne. And it was developed by Olivia Heydrich, the engineer at Newcastle. And it's essentially compressed recycled plastic. It's used in kind of sustainable urban drainage. It's used on green roofs. And Wolfgang, as soon as he spotted it, saw a fantastic opportunity as a kind of a building material he could use in his artwork. Which, of course, for this project, he had used it before this project. This project, given its kind of focus on climate change, seemed a brilliant material to actually use. So we actually used this material and shipped it out from the UK to Singapore, and then it stayed in Singapore and is kind of buried in some kind of project there. But there seemed to be a nice metaphorical kind of journey there about plastics, which have been moving around and then got reused in this. Whoop. Don't think that's me. Someone's calling me.
Sorry.
The global world.
Somebody's in trouble.
So I'm not going to go through all the kind of facts, and we wrote a paper up around this. But the idea again was to do this interdisciplinary collaborative work, architecture, engineering. Here's a picture of the kind of Aquadyne, but even better, you can see a very small piece of it there. So we produced this stilt house on, how many people know Singapore? Orchard Road, which is the premier shopping. So we didn't get a lot of choice about sites, but this actually in the end seemed perfect. It was this one little tiny oasis of green in this kind of temple to consumerism, really, where we erected this stilt house. And one of the key things, and actually that came out of the conversation, Wolfgang, I think there's an interview with him in the book, he talks about this, is the moment where we decided it was really important to make this piece permeable, that people could go in there to have conversations. So we literally made it a kind of platform for kind of conversation and dialogue. And I did lots of kind of vox pops kind of interviews there with people, trying to entice them up and have conversations around Singapore and the city. And we got people there talking about their memories of actual stilt houses and starting to talk about the direction that Singapore had taken, etc. So it became this kind of space, this platform where people could actually have debates about kind of urban form and urban futures. So that was it. Sadly it was only up for about a week. It would have been great to leave it longer, because in that kind of climate you could imagine all kinds of things happening to the aqueduct in terms of things growing in it and changing colour and whatever. So it was a shame we couldn't leave it for longer. But having done that, we decided we should try and do something which did have a slightly longer time span if we could. But as ever, getting funding for these kinds of projects seemed very challenging. But Wolfgang is a very determined person. And we kept on meeting and talking, and we developed an AHRC bid without a great deal of hope. But actually, having developed this bid, we put it in and we got it funded. And the project was called Jetty, and it was to, well, these are the kinds of research questions directly from the kind of proposals. So had the usual kind of problem trying to translate our kind of our interests and our very open methodological approach to a kind of standard research grant application. You will probably face those kinds of challenges, I would imagine, but we have to frame it in the kind of way of how can public artworks animate community involvement in advancing, exploring sustainability issues, what are the range of environmental concerns mobilised in these debates, etc., and what's the potential legacy and impact. Hence where we ended up with the title of Catalyst and the kind of our current concerns about the idea of being a catalyst. Again, in order to do this, and this was a big part of the project, both in terms of getting the bid together, and I guess increasingly as researchers we're all involved in this, because the days when you could kind of develop a proposal almost on your own and just say what you were going to do and plan the outputs have almost gone now, I think, really. From the beginning now, you have to have a sense of who else is going to be involved, who's going to be interested, to what degree are they directly involved and directly benefiting the project. It's just kind of coming standard, but particularly so in projects like this, in which we actually not only assemble people who are interested, people who are actually going to supply things like large amounts of scaffolding and things, and local authorities and etc. who are going to allow us to do things. So when you're putting big structures on listed kind of monuments, it gets very, very complicated. So we had to assemble all of that in advance just to get the agreements to do the project, and then of course the usual thing, once you get the money you have to actually make it happen. So what is a STAIDS? How many people know what a STAIDS is? We work actually primarily for, this was Angela's work, we've established this is actually quite a global typology. So a STAIDS is it's a kind of landing platform. Angela, you correct me if I'm saying anything incorrect here. A landing stage in which you have the railway tracks, so it's linked to a coal mine, I guess, a distribution centre. The trains actually drive on top of the stays and actually deliver the coal, or in this, is this wood on this one? Materials that are often coal, onto a ship to go off to kind of power stations. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's more or less right. So you can see various ones. Was this one Pittsburgh?
Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania. Where this one, but you get the idea of what they are. Now, Dunstan stays, there were a number along the time, quite a number of these. This is the last one standing. It's listed now and reputed to be the largest wooden structure in Europe. You're looking at Angela to make sure I got this right.
Yeah, nothing's contradicted me yet, so.
Yeah, okay. So here we are, 1970, I think it went on operating until the 80s, more or less, though obviously very sporadically at that time. You can see the kind of industrial area it is. There are other images within the book. And during the 1980s, when did it actually close again, Angela?
1981.
1981. It was then clear, so there was an immediate sense of what do we do with this monument now. There were various attempts made. The land was cleared for a garden festival in the mid-80s.
1990.
It was in 1990, okay. But the question around this area is one generally of a kind of urban regeneration and kind of obviously with the death of the kind of coal industry and shipbuilding as well. What do we do with these communities who are very tenacious communities? And this is actually a picture. Just met with Angela before and she reminded me. I thought this was an old historic picture, one Angela took. So there's been a real problem actually in reshaping these kinds of communities. And people are there and there's a strong sense of local identity and people don't want to move. So this area was...
Yeah, it's scheduled for demolition, but the people would move out, so it's 6 years and it's still not been demolished.
Very strong sense of local pride. However, there is there has been developments here. This was a Wayne Hemingway development. In direct contrast to those kind of original communities, these are kind of the classic imported middle class, I guess, kind of communities in terms of a kind of eco-development. Glossy, glitzy, seen as successful in direct contrast really to some of the traditional communities around, and this is literally facing the States. So this is an area of urban regeneration, social polarization to some kind of degree, quite a socially charged kind of area. And more than that, since its disuse, this has become a kind of very interesting ecological kind of area. This is literally around now, the States has become a kind of mudflats. And it's become a breeding ground for all kinds of species. So here's the Stays now. There was also another part of the story was a fire. Again, lots of kind of informal, illegal kind of activity going on the Stays. It's provided a long-standing kind of platform since it's closed down for people actually kind of going onto the stage and using it for their own ends, their own means, their own enjoyment. And unfortunately, in one particular case, this enjoyment spilled over into a fire, and part of the Stays was lost. So. Some of the work we did, again, I'm not spending a lot of time talking about some of the more formal kind of work we did, kind of interviewing and running focus groups with people to try and establish the kinds of range of environmental concerns. So connecting back to our long-standing interest in how environmental and sustainability issues kind of get framed in a particular kind of urban context. And you can see, again, a real kind of complex mix of environmental issues shaping this kind of area. So it's a very kind of rich context to be working in. So here's another little video. Now you actually get to hear Wolfgang, if I can make it work, talking about the project.
The major project I'm currently working on
Wolfgang.
is an engagement or an interaction with the Dunstan States, Gateshead around the corner here. The Dunstan States is the largest wooden structure in Europe. It's a fascinating piece of architecture. A jetty which goes out into the water where the coal trains would offload their coal into barges on the river. At the moment, because it's derelict, since about 30-40 years, it's also an environmental protected site.
You can't hear that, can
It's
you?
also a piece of industrial heritage, one of the few
Can you hear?
pieces of industrial heritage of this region.
People at the back are doing that.
And nobody knows what to do with it.
No, maybe you could say
Do
what
it
you
again?
say if you...
But it's a piece of heritage. And how do we
You can
sustain
pause it. Do you want to?
And
I don't know if I can make it work. That's
Okay, well, don't worry.
which
If you can't, then you can't.
specifically looks at sustainability. I wanted to find out what
Maybe
sustainability
you
actually
could say
means. What kind of level does it have?
people can't hear.
I thought an art project could be a catalyst to trigger this kind of discussion. And I picked the Dunstan
Perhaps if you can come a little
States
nearer, there's plenty of space if you can't hear.
structure, which actually ticks a lot of the sustainability boxes in the sense of that you can take and ask questions about it. So what you see here is this is a part of the Dunstan States. The Dunstan States is made out of kind of frames, and actually I'm making a 1:10 maquette. It's approximately
Maybe you
between
could
60
say what
and
you're saying because we heard
80
it.
meters high. It's an enormous thing. About 10 years ago, or 8
don't want
years
to speak
ago,
for him.
a section of the Dunstan States got damaged through fire and is missing now. And what I do here in my maquette is I want to rebuild the missing section. So in a way, building the gap, physically repairing it in a maquette. But at the moment, we wanted to start the whole discussion by really putting an architectural scale sculpture on top of it. And we're using a material called aqualine, which is recycled plastic waste. So we're putting an enormous amount, 10 tons of recycled plastic waste on top of the skates in form of a huge cone. The material also looks like cone, which again kind of like links it back to the material, which was the prime export here and what the jetty was used for.
Did people get that? The people at the back, did you kind of follow? I mean, he was basically leaving a little bit of the background that I gave you as well. I'm trying to. The reason for showing it really was to hear the project in the words of Wolfgang, and how he saw the project and how he saw the artistic role within it. And he was talking there about, and this was the original idea that we couldn't do in the end because we couldn't get enough scaffolding. It was just too big an engineering, too costly, too big an engineering job. So again, interesting. There's lots of kind of related lines of inquiry in projects like this. So how do you understand backwards a piece of artwork? And most of the kind of work will start with a kind of object. But actually to understand the jetty project and what ended up there, you need to understand all of these kind of side stories which are to do with costs and engineering and planning, to understand why the final artistic form is in a particular kind of way. So this was his original kind of idea. He was very keen to kind of bridge this kind of gap there, but as I said, we couldn't do it. And in one way, it's the other part of the problem he had when he was thinking about this, that he had certain doubts about it, was it just wasn't going to be very prominent. So the sense of actually producing an art object, and would this be enough, was another part of the kind of issue. So he came up in the end with this idea of a cone built out of the kind of the aqueduct, quite a lot of the aqueduct, as you can imagine. So where did this idea come from? Well, Wolfgang does, and if you read the book and read the interview, will talk about certain kind of reference points. So he talks about this Leamington glass cone. So for him, this was a kind of historical reference which might be meaningful to people. And interestingly, this was one of the tensions, I think, for Angela and I. So coming back to this question, what difference did it make embedding, connecting work of fine art with work of social science? Because in one way, if the historical referencing here is just a simple aesthetic object that's copied, what difference does the social science make? But as you read into the book and read what Wolfgang says, on the one hand, he'll throw this as a throwaway kind of reference. On the other hand, he says, actually, it doesn't matter, it's not important. It's not important what the object was. The object just needs to be there to attract attention and to encourage people to think, to see differently and think differently and engage with the stage in a different kind of way. So there's the actual kind of object. So again, following this kind of a line of inquiry, the story, the alternative story of the production of the piece is not so much the images of cone on a sunny day, of which you'll see many in the book. It's overcoming all of these kinds of material, legal, technical kinds of challenges to do the assembly of the sculpture, the amassing of all this aquadyne, and I think that's some of the things that you would remember here. So there's 2,200 sheets of 5 kilogram aquadyne. Cone took 9 days to erect using apprentices from Gateshead College and the scaffolding company Mears. Each of the individual panels, which amounted to a total of 11.5 tons, including 3 tons of scaffolding, had to be handled up, manhandled up. There's the images there to the top of the stairs. Then they had to pictures of this. Following the mark out of the footprint of cone by the structural engineer, apprentices started the process of laying the spiralling conical pattern of full-size panels interspersed with 2/3 cut pieces and ensuring a continual even spacing. So this is from there's a chapter in the book talking about the kind of technical side of this. So after the structure reached about 2 meters high, the scaffolding contractor came on site to erect the central scaffolding tower, which reached a height of just under 9 meters, allowing the apprentices to build up the full height of the cone, etc., etc. So actually the intersection of the different kinds of skills here are absolutely essential to understanding how cone came about. There's Angela and part of the research team. And here's the guy who had to stand by through the whole of this on the boat in case anyone kind of fell in. And the amount of negotiation just trying to get on there and having the health and safety around trying to do this, including men in boats, was really quite extraordinary. Certainly a lot of learning in terms of planning a project from my point of view. So that's what we end up with. And there was a whole set of events, I've got some slides I'll show you in a moment, around this and forms of public engagement. But at the end of it all, and there were lots of conversations with the Baltic Art Gallery around having exhibitions there and so on and so on. And when we came to the end of the project, as I said, the unusual thing about this is trying to understand what happened in the project during the project and actually produce a piece of work which is not only analytical, kind of backward looking, but also it somehow is going to continue the conversation going forward. So how do we think about this kind of work? How did we start to think about it? What do you find if you read in the book? Well, on the one hand, you can discover in there a kind of fairly conventional narrative of fine art and fine art practice, where Wolfgang, the famous international artist, responds to a particular kind of site and particular kind of issue, and in really kind of creative and kind of ingenious kind of ways, produces what actually really are beautiful, creative, ingenious kinds of structures which can be read and enjoyed within that framing very nicely. And again, I've mentioned a few times through this tour the links with architecture, and here's a famous quote from Louis Kahn, modernist architect, talking about materials. You think of brick, for instance, and you say to brick, what do you want, brick? Brick says, I like arch. So you say to brick, look, arches are expensive. I can put a concrete lintel over you. What do you think of that brick? Brick says, I like arch. So this kind of narrative of actually artistic production for its own sake almost, to produce objects of beauty. And that's there, I think, in Jetty. Interestingly, this was put up for one day in order to have a photograph of. So this was a piece that Wolfgang was trying to find a place to show it, and he still wants to find a place to show it. But in order to complete the project and complete the book, we assembled it for one day. Angela was there during the construction to have beautiful photographs taken in. So that's part of this story. But of course, there are other parts of this story. You can go back and I haven't done, but I could write articles placing this within my earlier work around this kind of complex history of architecture. Having done this for sustainable architecture, Angela and I have got an article planned around mapping this in relation to sustainable art. So again, from within the social science kind of realm, we can use this material to think about sustainable art and cities in a particular kind of way. We can do that, and there's a little bit of element of that in the book. We can mobilise, can we still call them fashionable kind of arguments around assemblage and assembly theory, and talk about the kind of complex social, technical ordering and reordering of people, places, materials, nature, in order to understand and to make Jetty happen. We can think interestingly about that, and there's an interesting story there, I think. We can talk about social complexity and do kind of social mapping, again within a social kind of science frame. And here's an original mapping of the kind of actors and agencies, institutions that we found, which we did in kind of very early work that Angela did, mapping the kind of social organisation of interest in the area. And then we can say what happened through the process of Jetty was a whole set of new actors and institutions and agencies were introduced into kind of conversation. And we can do some interesting kind of social mapping around the project. Again, there's a small element of that in the book. That's a theme that can be developed. The thematics of the innate kind of research agenda co-production, I think we can play into quite strongly. And there's this idea of actually, if you're genuinely interested in co-production, whether it's with someone outside a university or in a very different discipline, it often means you need to embrace uncertainty. But our research projects demand a sense of what we're going to actually deliver, because they want to reduce the kind of uncertainty, reduce down the risk in handing over what's often quite large amounts of money. So we want to play in this kind of area, and we start to believe in these ideas. How do we actually get over, how do we actually sell the idea of uncertainty, of fluidity, in terms of our approach and our outcomes? That's something else that I think is interesting to me, reflecting back on our project. I think probably that's a good time to stop, is it? I can talk more than that. So I'll stop there and leave it in that kind of open, uncertain, fluid way, and look forward to a discussion.
Thank you very much.